Let me try it again. But my last time on earth, I lived a whole world of sin. I'm so glad I know more than I knew then. Gonna keep on trying until I reach my highest ground.
In September 1947, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading African-American newspapers in the United States, ran an article that announced Chicagoans have a new religion for a new church. The article emphasized that this new church would not be bound by the limitations of traditional theology. Instead, the article stressed that this church, every person, through the use of his or her own reason and conscience, can best arrive at their own creed. And they believed in freedom from bondage to creed or prejudice, and freedom for enlightenment. The new church embraced the democratic process and scientific inquiry and rejected any truth once and for all delivered. Jesus and salvation were not the focus of this church. Rather, they stood for universal brotherhood, the abolition of racism, and the abolition of imperialism. Their goal was to help usher in a world community, united as one. The new church was a humanist, predominantly Black, multiracial Unitarian congregation on the south side of Chicago. They called the new church the Free Religious Fellowship, and their minister was one of the first Black Unitarian ministers to serve a predominantly white congregations in the United States. His name was Louis McGee. McGee had followed in his father's footsteps and became an African Methodist Episcopal AME minister when he graduated from Payne Theological School in 1916. He enlisted in the U.S. Army as a chaplain and served Black troops during World War I. After the war, he married, and he and his wife, Ruth Elizabeth, and their 3 children, Louis, Ruth, and Charles Jr., would later become one of the famous Tuskegee Airmen and a decorated war hero. Now, when McGee returned from the war, he was called to serve a small AME church outside of Cleveland, but he struggled with his theology. The theology that he had learned at school and in his father's church, it was not the theology that spoke to his experience. The church he served was small, and like many AME ministers, he worked a second job to make ends meet. He found work with the U.S. Postal Service as a delivery man. Now, McGee discovered Unitarianism by accident. One day, as he was gathering the mail for his regular route in Shaker Heights, something caught his eye. It was a magazine, and it was called The Christian Register. It's a periodical produced by the American Unitarian Association, and he was intrigued when he opened it up and he saw some of the titles of the articles. McGee decided to delay the magazine's delivery so he could have the opportunity to read it. And he liked what he read. But McGee also felt guilty for delaying the delivery of that magazine. Years later, he reflected on the incident. My good Methodist conscience took over, and as I returned the delayed delivery, I decided to ring the doorbell, and I made my confession. The lady of the house answered, and she responded to McGee's confession, not with anger, but an invitation to keep the magazine and come to church with me at First Unitarian Church of Cleveland. McGee visited First Unitarian as soon as he had a free Sunday, and that Sunday service was a spiritual experience for him. There was a quiet pervading the atmosphere, he recalled. The sermon was inspiring. The hymns and readings were appealing. And he felt a strong pull towards the Unitarian Church in that moment. At last, he found a place that had met the theological yearnings that he had for many years now. Those theological yearnings had a home in the Unitarian Church. And McGee thought to himself, this is the kind of church I would like to minister to. But before McGee could come fully to terms with changing denominations, his family suffered a terrible tragedy. His wife, Ruth, died a few weeks after the birth of their third child. He was now a single father with 3 small children, and he put his plans for Unitarian ministry on hold as he grieved and struggled to support his family. However, McGee's interest in Unitarianism and a liberal, human-centered theology only continued to grow. It was about after 7 years McGee's visit to the First Unitarian Church in Cleveland, he ran across a book of humanist sermons by Curtis Reese. McGee traveled to Chicago to meet Reese and learn more about humanism. That's how passionate he was. Reese, like McGee, had found himself thinking about a new approach to religion that did not focus on God, but on the strength of human ethical action and reason. Many others gravitated towards this theological perspective, and by 1941, the American Humanist Association had begun. Now, for McGee, the prospects of becoming a Unitarian minister were not very encouraging. He consulted with Reese and later Meadville Lombard Theological School, the same school where I am a professor. But like other black ministers before him, McGee was met with racism, disguised as tepid reception and often active discouragement. They had a lot of reasons why it wouldn't be a good idea for him to pursue Unitarian ministry. In particular, Unitarian leaders felt that no white congregations would accept McGee as their minister. I'm going to sit with that for a moment. They didn't think any of the predominantly white congregations would accept McGee as their minister. But they didn't even let him try. They suggested that to be a Unitarian, he'd have to gather his own congregation. McGee had trouble seeing the way forward with a young family to care for, and so he continued as an AME minister, serving small congregations, but he did join the board of directors of the American Humanist Association and worked for them for over a decade. The outbreak of World War II turned out to be a transformative moment for McGee. He volunteered to re-enlist as an Army chaplain, even though he was in his 50s, even as his own son was starting to fly bomber missions, combat missions, as a part of the Tuskegee Airmen. And during one of the most devastating battles of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, McGee had a pivotal experience. As the battle raged nearby, McGee lay in his army cot listening to what he called the buzz bombs flying overhead, and he feared for his life. In that moment, he wondered, why risk one's life for your country and not give one's life in service to your ideals? In that moment, he knew that if he survived the war, he had to pursue Unitarian ministry. Now was the time, he felt, his life would be less lived unless he became a Unitarian minister. McGee, as we sometimes say when we start worship, got after it. Let's get to it. He got after it. He got to it. He returned in 1945. He moved to Chicago. He earned a degree in social work. And in the spring of 1946, he sought entry to Meadville Lombard Theological School. It was Meadville Lombard Theological School. And the school, as I said, where I teach today, but he was 54 years old. And although the school admitted McGee for a Doctor of Divinity degree, which he completed in 1949, many of the conversations he continued to have with Unitarian leaders and faculty were discouraging. So while Unitarians wrestled with what to do with McGee and his call to ministry, he walked into a Chicago Public Library branch and met a librarian, Marcella Walker, a divorcee, a mother of a daughter, a woman of a prominent Chicago black family, and they soon got married. Together, they decided, why wait? Let's start the new church, this new kind of church, and they did so in the living room of a friend's home, and then they moved to rented space. This new church attracted a variety of people, including members of the Chicago Black Renaissance. Look it up after church today. It is such a wonderful movement of writers and arts and flourishing in Bronzeville and Chicago. Marcella McGee took on leadership roles in the church while Louis McGee served as the minister. Marcella's library job made Louis's ministry possible. The church could only provide a meager salary. But soon, they had 100 members. By their 7th meeting, they opened a Sunday school because they had so many children. And they continued on their way, trying to get that momentum they so eagerly desired. But troubles plagued the burgeoning Free Religious Fellowship, from difficulty finding a stable meeting location to not receiving financial support from the American Unitarian Association's program for new churches. After 5 years of struggles, the McGees decided it was time to leave. Marcella wanted to retire, and Louis left the Free Religious Association to work for the American Humanist Association, but he missed ministry. So when the leading humanist, Stephen Fritschman, the minister of the Unitarian Church in Los Angeles, decided to integrate his congregation, whether they liked it or not, by hiring a Black associate minister, he contacted Louis McGee, and McGee gladly accepted. A few years later, Louis McGee was called to the Unitarian Church in Chico, California, as one of the first Black ministers to lead a predominantly white Unitarian congregation. He worked in the civil rights. He worked his whole life for the things that he cared about the most: humanism, Unitarianism, and social justice. Time and time again, Louis McGee sought higher ground, where he could see another path beyond what others imagined for him and Unitarianism. The McGees envisioned a church that believed in reason and conscience, and in freedom from bondage to creed or prejudice, and freedom for enlightenment. They worked to cultivate a universal community, the abolition of racism and imperialism. They sought to create a church that offered hope and courage. And so do we, here, every Sunday, every day at All Souls, as we continue to live into the dream that Louis and Marcella McGee had more than 75 years ago.
So we celebrate Black history all year long here at All Souls. But in February, we take the opportunity to reflect even more directly on the lives of certain Black Americans who have shaped our collective story as a church and as a nation. People like Louis McGee and his wife, who Dr. Kirk just told us about, and others whose courage and vision have pushed us closer to the ideals of justice and equality and love beyond belief. Today, I want to introduce you to a Black Unitarian woman pioneer who not only fought successfully for racial and gender justice in the 1800s, but who did so as part of All Souls Unitarian Church in Chicago. All Souls Church in Chicago in the 1800s was the original All Souls Church that began the movement of which this church is a part. And it was multiracial from the very beginning. First, I want to share a little bit about the founding of All Souls Church, the movement within Unitarianism. All this information that I learned about All Souls Chicago is from the biography of the woman I want to focus on, Fannie Barrier Williams. It describes the founder of All Souls, Reverend Jenkin Lloyd Jones, whose ministerial robe hangs down in a case outside the Children's Chapel here. He served as the secretary of the Western Conference of Unitarians from 1875 to 1884, after serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. In fact, in the display case down by the Children's Chapel, there are the buttons from his Civil War uniform. Reverend Jones increased both the size and the relevance of Unitarianism in the Midwest. He was so successful in the 9 years that he did this, that the number of active Unitarian societies doubled. And during his tenure, he traveled over 120,000 miles and preached hundreds of sermons. On November 1st, 1882, he presented the sermon, The Ideal Church. This is what Jenkins Lloyd Jones said. It will be the thinker's home. The student of science will handle no discoveries that it will not prize. Oldest India and newest America will hold no gem of thought that will not be welcomed into its sacred scriptures. The skeptic of this church will be the cowards who dare not exercise the reason that God has given them. Over its entrances, no dogmatic test is to be written to ward off honest thinkers or earnest seekers. This church must emphasize the universal brotherhood or kinship of all humanity. It will stand upon a grand emphasis of the great word of the century, unity. It will seek to welcome low and high, poor and rich, unbeliever and believer. A little over a month later, after delivering this message on December 8th of 1882, the Church of All Souls Unitarian was born with Jones as its minister. Many in Chicago shared Jones's vision of a multiracial Christian institution that eschewed rituals and dogmas. The membership and the use of the facility increased so substantially that by 1886, a new structure had to be built. Prominent African Americans in Chicago were attracted to this church. One of them was Fanny Barrier Williams. Barrier Williams was born in 1855 in Brockport, New York, into a free and educated black family. Growing up in New York at this time, before the Civil War and before the end of American slavery, she wrote that she experienced relatively little racism as a child. But when she left to teach in the post-Civil War South, she encountered the deep cruelty of Jim Crow segregation. This experience transformed her, sharpened her commitment to racial justice. She moved to Chicago with her husband, Samuel Lang Williams, and quickly became a leader in both the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Rights Movement. She eventually went on, she was one of the eulogists at Susan B. Anthony's inauguration. She supported the Tuskegee Institute and did so much incredible work. She worked to open doors for black women in higher education and employment and in civic life. She was one of the first African-American women to be admitted to the Chicago's Women's Club, and she played a key role in the National Association of Colored Women. And in 1893, she stood before the World Parliament of Religions, making history as one of the first black women to speak on that global stage. This is something that she credits to her relationship with Reverend Jenkins Lloyd Jones. He was you can see her in this picture, by the way. She's sort of in the back with all these Chinese and Indian and other religious leaders from around the world who came together for the first time in the United States to share their religious practices and truths. This is when Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and the Tao Te Ching and all these kinds of things started to become known by Americans more and more. And these folks spread out and taught all over the United States, and it really spread Eastern philosophy and Buddhist thinking and other things, all credited to this Parliament of Religions in 1893. So Jenkins Lloyd Jones was the secretary, one of the founders of this Parliament of Religions, and they had no black female voices, so he recommended her to deliver a speech. And it was one that caught the attention and the respect of Frederick Douglass and others. And she used that moment to challenge the religious community to stand up against racial discrimination and truly embody the values that they preached. But Fanny Barrier Williams wasn't just speaking to the world. She was also speaking to Unitarians in Chicago. With Jones as their minister and Barrier Williams and other black leaders involved, All Souls Chicago became a hub for a reform movement and a number of reform movements throughout the nation. A place where issues of race, labor, and education were discussed with urgency and moral clarity. Jones and Barrier Williams also worked together to found the Abraham Lincoln Center, which was created as an extension of All Souls Church's social justice programs. The center was a beacon of progressive activism, promoting racial integration, education, and social services for the city's marginalized communities. It was a space where people of different races, classes, and beliefs came together in pursuit of justice. Barrier Williams' presence and leadership were transformational. Her connection to Unitarianism was not just intellectual, it was lived. She called upon Unitarians to move beyond the comfort of progressive ideals and take real, meaningful action against racism. She believed that true faith demands engagement with the world's injustices. Her words still challenge us today. As Unitarian Universalists and as a part of the legacy of All Souls Chicago, we pride ourselves on being a faith of inclusion, a faith that stands for justice. And Barrier Williams' story reminds us that inclusion is not a passive ideal, it's an active commitment. It is the work of opening doors, amplifying voices, and dismantling barriers. As we honor her legacy, let us not only remember her name, but also embody her spirit. Let us ensure that our congregation, like All Souls Chicago and the Abraham Lincoln Center in her time, is a space where justice is not just spoken, but lived. May we be bold enough to follow her example and to be a church for all souls. A church that not only sits on higher ground, but builds it.
Don't you let